To begin, this is a dual action gravity fed airbrush. Now this is a very standard type of airbrush that you would find on the market. Gravity fed simply means that the paint will go into the cup here and gravity will pull it down into the belly down here, which it then obviously sprays out through the front. Dual action means that the trigger, you push down for air and you pull back for paint. So if you were to paint something, you would be pushing down for your air, pulling back for your paint, and spraying it that way. Now with the dual action system, it is very, very important to really sort of practice it and get used to how much air you want to use and also how far back to pull the trigger. Because if we're pulling the trigger all the way back, that means that we are completely opening up the airbrush and we're going to spray a lot of paint. So that's okay if you're doing things like priming, for instance, if you want to just absolutely just blast some paint onto your model to prime it. But if you're doing things that are a bit more detail work, such as like power swords, stuff like that, you want to really play around with it and just sort of know whereabouts to pull your trigger back to and how far down to push it for how much air you need. The first bit of equipment that I would recommend to a beginner is getting one of these. This is an airbrush painting pot. Now, these are really good for two reasons. First off, they are good for resting your airbrush in them. So when you come to fill up your airbrush with your paint, you can just rest it in here and not touch it. And secondly, they are very good because in here, there is a filter. So when you're cleaning your airbrush and you're sort of blasting through the remainder of your paint and your airbrush cleaner, it A, prevents any overspray because you're spraying it into the pot, and B, because of the filter, it will basically get rid of any of the harmful vapors that can come from spraying things such as airbrush cleaner and metallics, things like that. Next up is one of these. This is just a very basic squirty bottle with a bent nozzle. You can just pick these up on places like Amazon, for instance. Now these are very good because the bent nozzle allows you to get right down into the belly of your airbrush to help clean it. This has just got a mixture of water and airbrush cleaner inside of it, and then like I say, because you can get all the way down into the belly, you can use it to dislodge any stuck paint. So up next we have airbrush cleaner and airbrush flow improver. We'll take a look at flow improver first. So essentially what this does is two different things. The first thing is that it will actually thin out your paint in your airbrush, allowing you to spray any paint through your airbrush with ease, basically. So if we were taking something like this is a base color from Games Workshop. This is quite a thick paint. If we were to put this straight into our airbrush without any flow improver, it wouldn't spray through. It would pretty much like instantly clog on the nozzle. So the flow improver, you always put this in first. You put a couple of drops into the actual belly of the brush and then put your paint in, mix it all around, and it will thin the paint out in the actual airbrush. Now on the bottles it will typically say something like 1 to 2 drops of this to a brush full or 10 drops of paint. I typically find that this is completely wrong, and 1 to 2 drops of flow improver to that much paint wouldn't really do anything. So honestly, just err on the side of doing too much flow improver, because if your paint is thinned quite heavily in an airbrush, it doesn't particularly matter because you can lay down 2, 3, 4, even like 5 really thin coats really quickly with an airbrush. So by all means, just err on the side of giving it too much flow improver, because that way you're not going to clog your airbrush basically. The second thing that it does is it is actually a medium that helps to increase the drying time of your paint. Now this sounds kind of counterproductive, however in an airbrush you've got your needle just here. What you don't want is for any paint to dry on your needle tip, because as you come back into the airbrush for more paint, this dried paint here will clog in the nozzle. So the flow improver, because of the fact that it increases the drying time, means that you're not going to get paint drying on your needle tip and therefore prevents clogs. One thing to bear in mind is to not confuse flow improver with airbrush thinner. because the thinner essentially does the opposite. Yes, it will, as the name suggests, thin your paint, but the thinner actually increases the speed of which the paint does dry. So compared to what we just said about it drying on the needle, if you used airbrush thinner instead, it would actually cause the paint to dry on your needle quicker and therefore actually give you clogs. So airbrush cleaner, this is what we're going to use, as the name suggests, to clean our airbrush. So this stuff helps to get rid of any of the lodged paint that we have in our airbrush. So if we have any paint when we're done that's inside the cup and equally down here in the belly, we will be spraying this in to our airbrush, and that will help to get rid of it. And then secondly, it actually helps to lubricate the airbrush, just basically maintaining everything, make sure it all runs nice and smoothly and we don't get any damages or anything like that. So the airbrush cleaner and the airbrush flow improver, honestly, I would say are the two most important things to get for airbrushing as a beginner, because without both of these, you'll find that airbrushing can be a bit challenging. Like I say, you know, you're not going to be able to use things such as the base paints from Citadel. You can still use some like air range paints, but even then, I like to use things like flow improver with them and then clean them with the airbrush cleaner. And lastly on my list, we have some very, very cheap, just naff brushes basically. These are really good for simply just putting paint from, say, a GW paint pot into your airbrush and mixing it around, because it doesn't matter if we get the paint into the ferrules because they are very, very cheap. Secondly, these are cotton buds. These are very good for cleaning. So we've rinsed out our airbrush and we can use the cotton buds to come in and just work it around into the bottom of the airbrush down here to again get rid of any of that lodged paint in there. Equally, when we strip down the airbrush and take things like the needle and stuff out, the cotton buds are very good for just wiping down the physical needle.